The Cold War, a 45-year standoff between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. We often think of it as a chess match played by politicians and spies, a war of ideologies fought in the shadows. But what if I told you there were moments, secret operations, and terrifying close calls that pushed humanity to the very edge of annihilation, far more often than we were ever told? These weren't just tense negotiations or diplomatic standoffs. These were active, classified military operations, gambles with the fate of the world, where one wrong move, one miscalculation, could have triggered a global nuclear holocaust. Today, we're declassifying the files. We're diving deep into the secret history of the Cold War to uncover the operations that almost ended everything. Let us start with a story that sounds like it is straight out of a Hollywood thriller, but it was terrifyingly real. It's called Operation Chrome Dome. From 1960 to 1968, the U.S. Strategic Air Command kept a fleet of B-52 bombers, each carrying multiple hydrogen bombs, in the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Think about that. At any given moment, a dozen or more planes loaded with city-destroying weapons were circling the globe, flying routes that took them right up to the borders of the Soviet Union. The idea was to have a constant airborne nuclear alert force, ready to retaliate instantly if the Soviets launched a first strike. This ensured that even if U.S. air bases were wiped out, the bombers in the air could still deliver a devastating counterattack. It was the ultimate deterrent. But what happens when the ultimate deterrent goes wrong? This is where Chrome Dome becomes one of history's most frightening near misses. Flying these massive bombers for days on end was exhausting for the crews and put immense stress on the aircraft. And inevitably, accidents happened. They were called broken arrows incidents involving nuclear weapons. During the 8 years of Operation Chrome Dome, there were at least 5 major B-52 crashes involving nuclear bombs. The most famous was the 1966 Palomares incident in Spain. A B-52 collided with a KC-135 tanker during mid-air refueling. The bomber broke apart, dropping its 4 hydrogen bombs. 2 of the bomb's conventional explosives detonated on impact, spreading radioactive plutonium across the Spanish countryside. A 3rd bomb was recovered relatively intact. The 4th? It fell into the Mediterranean Sea, triggering a massive, frantic 80-day search effort by the U.S. Navy. They eventually found it, but the incident caused a major diplomatic crisis and a radiological contamination that took decades to clean up. Imagine the panic if one of those bombs had fully detonated. The operation was a constant high-stakes roll of the dice with the future of the planet. While the Americans were keeping nukes in the sky, the Soviets were busy putting them under the sea. This brings us to the Cuban Missile Crisis, a story we all think we know. But there's a secret chapter you probably haven't heard, a story that takes place deep beneath the waves of the Atlantic. During the crisis in October 1962, as President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev were locked in their high-stakes standoff, the U.S. Navy was hunting Soviet submarines near the quarantine line around Cuba. What the Americans didn't know was that some of these submarines, specifically 4 Foxtrot-class subs, were armed with nuclear-tipped torpedoes, and their commanders had been given permission to use them if their submarines were breached, or if they believed war had already broken out. Let's focus on one submarine, the B-59. It was being relentlessly pursued by a fleet of American warships. The U.S. Navy, unaware of the nuclear torpedo on board, began dropping small, non-lethal depth charges. These were practice charges meant to signal the submarine to surface. But down in the claustrophobic, sweltering confines of the B-59, the crew didn't know that. Their communications with Moscow were cut off. The air conditioning had failed. The temperature inside was soaring. All they knew was that they were under attack. The captain of the sub, Valentin Savitsky, was convinced that war had already started. He panicked and ordered the crew to prepare the nuclear torpedo for launch. He shouted, "We're gonna blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all." A single nuclear torpedo could have vaporized an entire American carrier group. Such an attack would have triggered an immediate full-scale nuclear retaliation from the United States. The end of the world would have started right there, in the middle of the Atlantic. But launching required the agreement of 3 senior officers on board: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander, Vasily Arkhipov, who happened to be on the B-59. While the captain and the political officer agreed to launch, Arkhipov refused. He argued with the captain, calmed him down, and convinced him that the depth charges were a signal, not an attack. He single-handedly vetoed a decision that would have plunged the world into nuclear war. For decades, his role was completely unknown. Vasily Arkhipov is arguably the man who saved the world, a quiet hero whose story serves as a chilling reminder of how close we came to the brink. Now let's fast forward to the 1980s. The tension was just as high, but the technology had changed. The new front line of the Cold War wasn't the sky or the sea, it was the computer screen. In November 1983, NATO launched a massive military exercise called Able Archer 83. It was a command post simulation designed to practice and test the procedures for a full-scale nuclear attack. The exercise involved thousands of troops, heads of state including Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Kohl, and even the U.S. President and Vice President. It used new, highly encrypted communication channels and simulated every stage of a nuclear conflict, from initial alerts to the presidential launch authorization. To NATO, it was just a drill, the most realistic one they had ever conducted. But in Moscow, the view was very different. The Soviet leadership, led by the paranoid and ailing Yuri Andropov, had become convinced that the United States was planning a surprise nuclear first strike under the guise of a military exercise. They had a secret intelligence program, codenamed RYAN, tasked with finding evidence of this plan. When Able Archer 83 began, with its unprecedented realism, its radio silence, and its high-level participation, it ticked every single box on the KGB's checklist for an impending attack. The Soviets believed this was it. This was the real thing. In response, they placed their nuclear forces on high alert. Fighter bombers in East Germany and Poland were loaded with nuclear bombs, their engines running on the tarmac. ICBMs were prepared for launch. Soviet intelligence agents across Europe were ordered to look for final signs of war. The world was arguably closer to nuclear war during Able Archer 83 than at any other point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The danger was a feedback loop of paranoia. NATO was practicing for a Soviet attack, and the Soviets interpreted that practice as the prelude to a NATO attack. Fortunately, the exercise ended after 5 days without incident. The NATO forces stood down, and the Soviets, seeing this, cautiously did the same. It wasn't until a Soviet double agent, Oleg Gordievsky, defected to the West that NATO intelligence finally understood just how dangerously the Soviets had misinterpreted their drill. President Reagan was reportedly shocked when he was briefed on the incident. It profoundly changed his view of the Soviet Union, shifting him from a hardliner to someone who actively sought dialogue and arms reduction. He realized that a misunderstanding, a simple failure to see the world from the other side's perspective, could accidentally trigger Armageddon. From bombers that couldn't stay in the sky, to submarines that almost started a war, to a military drill that was mistaken for the real thing, these classified operations reveal a terrifying truth about the Cold War. It wasn't a stable, predictable conflict. It was a series of desperate gambles, moments of pure chaos, where our survival depended on luck, or the courage of a single individual, or the simple fact that a war game eventually ended. These stories, once hidden in classified archives, serve as a powerful warning. They show us how easily fear and mistrust can spiral out of control, and how technologies designed to keep us safe can, in an instant, become the instruments of our own destruction. Learning about these close calls isn't about fear-mongering. It's about understanding our own history and the immense responsibility that comes with possessing such awesome power. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the hidden history of the Cold War. If you found this fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more declassified stories. Let me know in the comments which of these operations you find the most terrifying. Stay curious, and I'll see you in the next video.